Hi, I'm Zach Singerman, and welcome to the Gen ZG Speaker Series. In this series, I will be interviewing national leaders on the topics of anti-Semitism, Israel, and leadership. Today, my guest is Congressman Max Rose, who represents New York's 11th Congressional District. Representative Rose is a veteran who served in Afghanistan and was awarded the Purple Heart. He is the chairman of the Intelligence and Counterterrorism Subcommittee that investigates white nationalist organizations and the rise in anti-Semitic domestic terrorism. The congressman also recently deployed with the National Guard during the pandemic. Congressman, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me, buddy. And what is a Gen Z? What qualifies a Gen Z?
So, Gen Z is my generation, and that is from, I believe, 1997 through 2010.
Woo! You're making me feel old, buddy. You're making me feel old, man.
So, in January, you chaired a subcommittee hearing on anti-Semitic domestic terrorism. Could you explain to a Gen Z Jew what led you to hold this hearing and what you feel the hearing accomplished?
Yeah, look, the reasons for the hearing were incredibly obvious. Is skyrocketing violence against skyrocketing anti-Semitism, skyrocketing anti-Semitic violence across the country, particularly in New York City. We saw the horrific violence in Muncie, horrific violence in Brooklyn. People afraid to go outside with their kippah, people afraid to congregate as Jews, afraid to go to shul. And something had to be done. But it's also really important to note that this is not a new problem. It's not a problem that went away and then came back. No, this is something that is rearing its roaring head, but has always been amongst us. It's one of, if not the oldest forms of hatred. And I don't think that we can afford to sit on the sidelines.
And you were also an original co-sponsor of the Domestic and International Terrorism Data Act, which is now law. Could you explain a little on what that law does and why it's important?
Yeah, so when you're looking at this issue of domestic terrorism, one of the biggest problems that we have faced is that it hasn't been tracked. Right? We don't have a domestic terrorism designation, but there are certainly acts of that if we did have that designation, it would be identified as such. It's also important to start to track the emerging groups, whether they're white nationalists, neo-Nazi, or so many others, and get an understanding of the hate that is fueling them, who they're targeting, where they're based out, and so on and so forth. We were dealing with a problem where the FBI wasn't taking this problem, and the entire law enforcement edifice wasn't taking this problem seriously enough. And I feel like this bill, amongst many others, is pushing these agencies in that direction.
And so, after a synagogue in Staten Island was vandalized, what was your first reaction, and how did you help the community come together?
I mean, it's just horrible. You're filled with anger, you're filled with disgust, you're filled with sadness. The fact that people in the shul needs to be a place of salvation, a place of hope, of strength, not a place where people spew hatred. And when this happened, I immediately went there and took part in painting over the graffiti. But it definitely pushed us even more to get this legislation done and also make sure that we are pushing further resources to synagogues and shuls so that they can protect themselves, or at least build out security apparatus to help themselves. And we were able to significantly increase the funding for the nonprofit security grant.
That's great. So when you were running for Congress in 2018 prior to the Tree of Life shooting, did you ever think that a large part of your legislative agenda would be white nationalism and anti-Semitism?
Well, I always knew that a big part of my agenda would be public safety. Mm-hmm. I proudly represent more law enforcement officials than the vast majority of other elected officials, and I also represent a district where people very rightfully care about the public safety of their community, as well as the public safety of other communities throughout New York City, as well as throughout the country. Addressing this emerging domestic terrorism threat, addressing this emerging source of hatred, addressing what is also a global threat can't just look at this domestically. It's no surprise to me that this became a huge priority for us.
Mm-hmm. And just like, I'm wondering, as a new father, does fighting anti-Semitism become more personal for you?
You know, I have been asked that. Yeah, of course it does. You know, my son, God willing, and the creek don't rise, will live into the next century. Mm-hmm. And so we are all collectively fighting for our children. We're collectively fighting to build a better country and a better world for them. And certainly that is a world where anti-Semitism has been pushed back. That is a world where we're safer. That is a world where we have pursued justice for all and safety for all. And so I'm touched that you would ask that. That's very much the case.
And one item that I'm trying to accomplish with my nonprofit for Gen Z Jews to be leaders and take a stand. And so you exemplify leadership by serving in the Army and running for Congress at a young age in a very difficult district to win. So what advice would you have for Gen Z in terms of leadership?
My advice is don't wait your turn. You know, don't let someone tell you it can't be done or this is how it's normally done. You'd be amazed at the degree to which people have no idea what they're talking about. There's nothing that hard work and solidarity and a plan, a well-resourced plan, cannot overcome. And then secondly, I'd say that we absolutely need you. We are living amongst the legacy of so many people who failed to fulfill their obligations to this country. And now it's your turn to step up. Don't wait. And don't think that there's someone smarter or more hardworking in another room. There's not.
Mm-hmm. That's very inspirational. So, Congressman, thank you so much for coming on and speaking today. I really appreciate it, and I think that like listening to what you had to say about these topics is incredibly helpful and inspirational.
Well, thank you, my friend, and thank you for everything you're doing, and consider me a friend, buddy.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thanks again.